And then we'll move on to a little different story of women in the Bible. So let's start with prayer. We thank you, good and gracious God, for the gift of your word and the witness of your people. We pray that you would hold up your word for us as both challenge and inspiration. And we give you thanks for the witness that we receive in the book of Ruth. Bless us with that wisdom today in Christ's name. Amen. So we are picking up the second half of chapter 4, and there are still a few things going on here that are, I think, interesting. The negotiation at the city gate has been completed, and Joe Schmo has been shown the wisdom of not entering into a property and marriage contract with Naomi through Ruth, and so now things are coming to an end, and so there are people at the city gate who are witnesses of all this, and that's where we'll pick it up at verse 11. Well, just to run into it, let's start at verse 10. This is Boaz speaking to those who are witnesses. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, the wife of Mahlon, to be my wife, to maintain the dead man's name on his inheritance, in order that the name of the dead may not be cut off from his kindred and from the gate of his native place. Today you are witnesses. Then all the people who were at the gate, along with the elders, said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you produce children in Ephrathah and bestow a name in Bethlehem. And through the children that the Lord will give you by this young woman, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When they came together, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without next of kin. And may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. The women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, A son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the descendants of Perez. Perez became the father of Hezron, Hezron of Ram, Ram of Amminadab, Amminadab of Nahshon, Nahshon of Salmon, Salmon of Boaz, Boaz of Obed, Obed of Jesse, and Jesse of David. The end. So I have several notes here, but is there anything that strikes you or that raises any thoughts or questions in those verses there? I do that so that I can have a bite of our snack here.
Hey. Well, I was kind of curious. It's not this, but how much territory did Perez get, being son of being one of the 12 tribes? How big was his area in Judea or Israel, or wherever his land was at? You know, they divided that land up between the 12 tribes. Well, 10 tribes, wasn't it?
It was 12 divisions,
right?
Because the sons of Joseph then count for 2 half-tribes.
One was a clerical tribe, though.
Levi doesn't have any land, right. So really it's 11.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh. Although sometimes, Gad and Manasseh are referred to as half-tribes because of being Joseph's sons. The division is not equal in terms of the land. I mean, Judah gets a much larger share than some of the others. And I don't know about Judah personally, but the tribe of Judah, the area of
Well,
Judah.
that'd be Perez, wouldn't it?
Yeah. And Bethlehem is a part of that. So that, whether those divisions that are described, and they're not described with any accuracy, whether those that are described in the Old Testament are how the boundaries actually worked out, is somewhat questionable. Or whether that's a story that is told to some degree after the fact, that these tribal boundaries existed and then the story is told. And historically, that's probably more likely how it happens, because, for example, Judah's this great big area, some of the others are relatively small areas. So probably it's more of a story to account for, or to bring it into the narrative, than it is a description of the legal process. So other thoughts or questions before we launch into my notes here? In chapter 4, verse 11, there is this really astonishing comparison. And that is the comparison between Ruth, who's not explicitly named right at that moment, but that's who is referred to. This connection between Ruth and Rachel and Leah. Rachel and Leah, Jacob's wives, who produce, along with Jacob's 2 concubines, the 12 sons that are the 12 tribes. So Rachel and Leah are Hebrews. I mean, they are not foreign wives. They come from Jacob's uncle Laban, or Laban, I should say. So it's all in the family, and so not so surprising that they would be regarded as builders of Israel. I mean, that's the case. I mean, they have Israel. Jacob's other name is Israel. They have Israel's children. But now Ruth the Moabite from Moab is described as being on a par with Rachel and Leah. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah. These are matriarchs of Israel. And for Ruth to be put on a plane with them is really kind of stunning. Quite a comparison for a Moabite woman. And here in Ruth, this is the only place in the Hebrew Bible where these matriarchs are described as those who are building up the house of Israel. Otherwise, it's always a male who does it. Yeah, Al.
So in Egypt, before they left, the 100,000 that was men, so about 400,000 people who left. Were those all descendants of Joseph?
Oh, so the question is, the Hebrews who left, the slaves who left Egypt, were they all related? Were they all from the same lineage? No. And the reason that we can say that with some conviction, well, no, let me give a qualified no. It's not quite as clear of those who left. But once in the wilderness, the group is described as a mixed multitude. That is the description that is given of those who travel in the wilderness. Now, does that mean that the Hebrew slaves brought with them other slaves from Egypt who, that seems likely, actually. Did they pick up sort of camp followers along the way who were not Hebrews? That seems likely as well. Yeah, Al.
Yeah, but when they marched out of there, they were in 12 tribes. 12 different groups marched out in Exodus. For
That's how it's described.
that's how
Yep.
it's described.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so that's one for each son.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Ooh.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I was wondering if they were all relatives. How they know which tribe to march with? If they're just marched with their relative, their son's relatives, the on down.
Well, as the narrative is shared in Genesis, Isaac and his remaining sons, they come to Egypt in the midst of this famine, and so the sons are clearly identified. I mean, right down to Benjamin, who Joseph wants to keep kind of as a hostage, and this is going to break their father's heart, and he'll die. And there's all that drama in Genesis. So the identity of those sons who come during the famine is clear. Wouldn't be surprising, I think, at all that those lineages are sustained over that 400 years. You just have to read in the Old Testament to see the significance of maintaining those genealogies, and we see that here in Ruth as well. So the fact that people would have a sense of their tribal identity, that they would sustain that, probably they worked even harder in this kind of almost exile in Egypt to maintain those identities. So the fact that they could identify themselves when they left Egypt, that's probably not very surprising. Does that mean that those are the only people who left at that time? Well, we don't know. But we do know that in the wilderness they're identified as a mixed multitude, so that along the way they become more than they were in Egypt. And the more is made up in part, at least, of, scholars think, non-Hebrews. And as a matter of fact, Hebrew is not really an ethnic designation. It's a description. The word really means wanderer. And it's not clear where that word comes from. There's an ancient word, Habiru, which sounds like it, which means wanderer or pilgrim. And so Hebrew may be more of a description of their status than their ethnicity at that point as wanderers. I mean, to be a Hebrew perhaps meant God set you free and you're out in the wilderness wandering. That's who the Hebrews are. So ethnicity is not something that is easily traceable, certainly not beyond the Babylonian exile, but probably really not back beyond David very much either. Tribal identity clearly exists, but how much that's genealogical and how much it's sociological, is everyone who's in Judah a descendant of Judah? Probably not. Probably not. Is there an allegiance to that tribe? Yes, probably. But those might not be the same thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just wondering.
Yeah.
Because now we're talking about one tiny little tribe out of all 12.
Mm-hmm.
And talking about one little area that they inherited, and one is the next inheritor, and he passes it up on his, and Boaz takes over. So.
And that's from that great big kind of global picture of all the tribes and all the people. I mean, that's one of the things that Ruth does, is takes us down to this almost microcosm here. This one person who is this critical link in this genealogy that as we read at the end produces David, the great king. And for Christians, of course, who produces Jesus as well. I mean, at this time of year, maybe we should hear some sort of echoes or reverberations of how all of the history of the cosmos for a moment becomes focused on one little manger also in Bethlehem.
I'd like to comment about the fact that you mentioned that Ruth's first husband apparently was sterile because she got pregnant with Boaz. But my book, and I don't know about yours, but mine says, and the Lord enabled her to conceive. Maybe it was an act of God that she conceived, and not the fact that her first husband was sterile.
Maybe those aren't mutually exclusive, too.
Pardon?
Maybe hooking her up with a fellow who was fertile was God's action.
Hey.
Well,
I mean, yeah, and
but it
maybe
says here the Lord enabled her to conceive. So, it's kind of like, was it Sarah that had the baby after 100 years, or when she was 100 years old or something?
Right, and clearly says there that Sarah was barren.
Yeah, and then the Lord. So, if they wanted this line of David, maybe that was an act of God that she became pregnant, not because.
My point is that in the ancient world, there was no understanding that men could be infertile.
Well, even today, men don't want to admit that.
Well, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, and so I don't know. I don't know what actually happened. I don't know. And you may well be right that God said, voila, now you can have babies.
Yeah.
That could be. But I do know that as ancient writers wrote these things, they simply didn't believe that men could be infertile. It had to be the woman's problem. Oddly enough, several times in the Bible and in other documents, when you get a different husband, you get babies. I mean, what's the common factor there? So it's more a cultural observation than a theological one. So it may well be.
Well, I just thought maybe your Greek interpretation might explain that a little bit. I didn't know.
No, I don't. No, it doesn't. It doesn't help us much one way or another on that one. So again, it's not necessarily that I would say yes. We can tell from the text that really it was that Mahlon was infertile and Boaz clearly is not. But it is interesting how often a different husband produces babies in a culture that's convinced that men cannot be infertile. Yeah, so more cultural than theological observation. Nonetheless, regardless of how the reproductive biology worked, the point is God makes it happen. I mean, that is clear from the text, that this is God bringing about something that for humans was apparently not possible. I mean, really, in the thinking, how could Ruth, the Moabite from Moab, how could she be part of this? How could that be? That's astonishing. How could she be a builder of the house of Israel like Rachel and Leah? I mean, that is miraculous. Regardless of the mechanism, it is miraculous.
But evidently the women of the neighborhood didn't want to give Ruth credit because they said a son has been born of Naomi. And they named him Obed. What's the meaning of that name?
Obed has to do with servant. One who serves. And it may have been short for Obadiah, which is a form of that name, which means one who serves the Lord, one who serves Yahweh. So the prophet Obadiah, for example, that's what that name means. And for the prophet Obadiah, it may be a first name or it may be a nickname. I mean, one who serves Yahweh. If you're a prophet and you get named one who serves the Lord, that's a clear connection. It's like calling a plumber, right? But that's what that name means. There are several interesting things there, Darlene. It's the women who name the child. It's the women of Bethlehem who name the child. That's just odd. Families give children names, not this sort of Greek chorus in the background
The
there.
women of the neighborhood
Right,
gave him the name.
right, yeah. Yeah, I had I had a colleague who had a baptism for with a family up in the Twin Cities, and I forget where they originated from, but they were immigrants. And it came time for the baptism, and they asked for the child's name, and they said, "Oh, you name him."
Gee.
Well, there was a little conversation after that. It sort of strikes me like that. The women name the child. Ruth has disappeared to some degree from the narrative. She's not named again very much. She doesn't speak. The women are talking with Naomi, not with Ruth, although they talk about Ruth in wonderfully approving ways. We should be clear about that. This woman is worth more to you, Naomi, than 7 sons. 7 sons would have been the ideal family in that culture. And so this daughter-in-law is worth more to you than that. I mean, that's quite a statement as well. It may mean that she might produce 6 more sons. That could be. But it really is significant.
So that was her value?
Well, that's a way to read it, Connie. One of the things we'll come around to is, just what are we supposed to get out of this book? What lens do we bring to it? What does it say to us? Does Ruth end up being sort of a broodmare? I'm not sure, but some scholars in particular read the book of Ruth, and that's the conclusion that they draw, that the intention is you have to think about, okay, when was this written? Who's reading it? I mean, if it is, for example, the people returning from exile and dealing with these mixed marriages, on the one hand, you can read Ruth as affirming the role of these foreigners in the genealogy of David, for example. Or you can read the very same text as saying, well, it was fine to have those wives while they were necessary, and now they are no longer necessary, now that the exile is over and we've returned, and so get rid of them. I don't know. I don't know which, if either of those readings was accurate in the beginning when Ruth was written. I don't know. But there is enough evidence in the text to read it just the way that you did. And there's enough evidence in the text to read the writer saying, what would we have done without these foreign women? What would we have done without Ruth? And I don't know which way is the way to read it.
Makes me more curious as to how the book of Ruth came about and who wrote it. I mean, they're just...
Yes. Again, and that's true for a lot of texts, but it's really true for Ruth. The interpretive lens that we bring to a text shapes what we see.
Sure.
Yeah, Carol, please.
I think it's interesting that after Naomi encouraged Ruth to sleep at his feet, whatever, God spared her the shame of getting pregnant until after they had married. Because, that would have been more gossip, more...
There's not much time that elapses.
Well, I know, but still, the fact that, the one phrase says God enabled her to
Yep,
conceive.
yep, and that that in the story it doesn't happen until after they're married.
Right.
Yeah, it does say that. And
Well,
Ruth,
to conceive, but we
Yeah.
still don't know what happened.
we,
at the
that's
threshing.
right, that's right. But we do know that Boaz regards Ruth as a worthy woman. That's high praise. That's not the kind of praise that you lavish on someone that you don't respect. But that still doesn't tell us about the behavior. However, again, to allow that culture to be what it was, when you think about how dishonoring and dishonorable that sort of midnight liaison would have been at the threshing floor, I am inclined to think that the storyteller thinks that nothing of physical consequence happened. But again, but the writer leaves it a little, more than a little ambiguous, leaves it in the shadows a bit. Nonetheless, the story is clear that Obed is legitimately conceived. You know, Ruth may be a Moabite from Moab, but Obed is not even in theory illegitimate. So that's significant, and is stated as part of God's intention. Let's see. Oh yeah. So we talked a little bit about that next line. Thank you, Ruth, about the verse 13. In verse 14, again, the Hebrew is a little bit ambiguous, but the context really says that the real redeemer for Naomi, the real restorer of her line, is this new son to be born. That ultimately the redeemer, the one who, and this will be true legally, you know, it will be this son who inherits the property and continues the line, and Obed is, you know, great grandfather, you know, to David, or there's a connection there. There might be a couple of generations in that genealogy that are left out, but it's not terribly significant. There's a direct line there. And then in verse 16, this business that Naomi became his nurse. The Hebrew there probably helps us. I mean, there are articles and other kinds of discussions on, you know, whether Naomi was Obed's wet nurse or not. Is this another, you know, miracle, etc. The Hebrew verb doesn't really support that. The verb that's used in the Old Testament, it's never used to describe breastfeeding. More care, babysitter is really much more the sense here. Although it's more than that, I think that really Naomi to some degree sort of takes custody of Obed, but doesn't nurse him as such. The verb means to support, to uphold, and nourish. In Isaiah 49, fathers can do this as well as mothers, so probably not a reference to breastfeeding. But some of the rabbis later said that this was another miracle, the miracle of geriatric breastfeeding without having born a child. That's what they wrote, and so who knows, but probably not. But Naomi is intimately involved then in the raising of Obed.
That something might have happened to Ruth.
Well, some
illness
yeah.
or you know, usually mothers don't give up their children to others' care unless there's some reason.
There is some wondering about that on the part of people who reflect on this. Does the writer just sort of wipe Ruth out at some point, or is the assumption that there was, you know, there's no mention, you know, of a death or disability in childbearing or anything like that. But again, how is it that Ruth just kind of gets slid off the stage?
Yeah.
There's this cheerleading about, hooray, isn't she wonderful, worth more to you than 7 sons, but she's no longer, you know, as Connie was noting, is she just no longer necessary? Is she just no longer part of the picture?
But, you know, the mothers, well, be mother-in-law, kind of, usually don't take over the care of the children in those days. I mean, like today they do a lot of times because of other reasons, but in those days, I think it was pretty much everybody took care of their own.
Well, if you look at, the definition of their own was much more expansive, I think. If you look at how Israelite houses were constructed in this time, in this kind of late Bronze Age, early Iron Age, many times they're built in a kind of a compound, so that there are multiple dwellings that open onto a common area. For example, that these houses and these Israelite houses are built almost, they're all about the same. It's an architectural style at this time that's so specific to the Israelites that you can use it to identify Israelite sites as opposed to Canaanite sites, for example. But often they're built in a kind of a compound, and so what it looks like is that there are multiple generations that occupy the same site. Maybe not the same building necessarily.
Like the grandparents' house.
Like a mother-in-law apartment sort of
There you go.
arrangement. That was fairly typical, so that the rearing of children very rarely would have been just on the part of the parents. Almost always would have been on the part of multiple generations and even the whole village. So the fact that the women name Obed, on the one hand, strikes us as a bit odd, perhaps. On the other hand, it really does show that Obed, he really belongs to the village, as well as to just the family. This is about sustaining not just a family, this is about sustaining the line. This is about sustaining Israel, ultimately. So the fact that Naomi would have been intimately involved with the child rearing, that's not so surprising necessarily. The fact that Ruth sort of disappears from the picture as mother strikes us as surprising. It's not clear to us what the writer intends there.
We also don't know.
You have a smile on your face, Linda. I just we'll let it germinate a little bit.
Well, I'll tell you, this Obed, but you know, all these women are raising him. Obed, Obey. Maybe they named him that because he was an ornery little kid, and Grandma was there to protect him.
So it may be that the name came later.
Yeah.
Straight from
Yeah.
grandma.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many things, and then when you look down here at what the point of it, and you look at assertiveness of women, and why Ruth left. Okay, why did she leave? Why didn't she go back to her family? Maybe there was no family to go to. Maybe she had to go to an uncle she didn't like, and so she stayed with her. She was being assertive. She took Naomi and where Naomi was older, an older woman, if she decides she's gonna do something, come hell or high water, Grandma Janie's gonna do it. And so, you gotta protect her some way. So, she was being assertive in that way. She came, she met with Boaz. We don't know what happened, but she went ahead and married him. Well, she disappears out of the story, but maybe she had to go and work in the fields.
Maybe,
But I-
maybe.
Maybe she,
No.
yeah, maybe
Had to
she
run his
died.
house.
Yeah, yeah,
Are,
maybe, yeah, there's,
you know,
why did they choose this book?
scholars wonder,
I'm not even a scholar.
That all led up to that. Yeah, that's good.
well,
Obey.
scholars wonder, are Ruth and Naomi, are they partners or are they competitors, for example? I mean, this is part of what you were, I think, wondering out loud as well, Linda. And maybe it's some of one thing at one time and some of another thing at another time. It may not just be, hardly ever is it all just one thing or another. But is this relationship between these women lifted up as complementary, as in solidarity, or is it in competition, or even sometimes hostility? Ruth pledges her faithfulness, her steadfast love. Naomi doesn't say a thing in response to that. I mean, okay, maybe Naomi is saying, "Isn't that lovely? I can hardly say anything." Maybe Naomi is saying, "Oh, for crying out loud, another mouth to feed." It just doesn't say. Is that ambiguity intentional? Does Ruth disappear from the scene because the real function of the story is to get to that genealogy, and everything else is subsumed to that? Is it important that Obed really does have an Israelite nana for him to really be in the line? Is that important? We don't know. And then the ultimate question: what's it doing in the Bible? What's it for? What does reading Ruth do for us? What does it do to us? What does it do through us? I mean, this again. It depends to some degree on the lens or lenses. I don't think there's just one way to read this. I don't think that's helpful. That we bring to the reading. And I wouldn't for a minute say you can just read whatever you want from the page. I think it's helpful to us to have these ideas, these proposals, and then say, well, how does that fit with what's there and what we know? And yeah,
How
Linda.
does this fit with women in the clergy?
How does this fit with women in the clergy? What do you think?
I think it has something to do with that.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
It has a lot that women can be assertive enough to be in the clergy,
Yeah,
for one thing.
yeah.
And we don't know, I mean, if I personally think Ruth kept nursing Obed, and that, Naomi was the nana, but Miriam was the silent partner in Moses too.
Yeah,
She
yeah.
kept nursing him, but I'm sure from what happened with Moses, that his mom had a lot of influence over him versus his adoptive mom.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting parallel, So Moses' mother sets things up so that she just happens to be very handy when Pharaoh's daughter needs a wet nurse. And then, of course, raises her own son. Another story of not only an assertive, but a clever woman.
Women have to be clever because they're just property.
Yeah, how do you, how do you get what you want and need in a system that is designed to make sure that you don't?
That's
tough spot to be in,
Yeah, yeah.
you know?
Welcome to our world.
I was my sister and I think Mom ran. Yeah,
What'd you say?
no, my sister and I feel like Mom.
Al, can you do that again, please?
Yeah, get that expression, right?
No.
Oh, yeah.
Welcome to our world. I mean, they got it so tough.
Hey, some stuff has changed. Honey, some stuff has changed.
You're backing out? Coward.
you dig a hole, you get out of it.
Now, shall we continue? No.
Well, isn't this? I mean, this little teasing back and forth. I mean, the Book of Ruth produces, forces some of that tension into the conversation.
Sure, sure.
And I think rightly so. I think that's helpful for the church. So to come back to your question, Linda, does this, can this inform conversations about women in church leadership, whether lay, ordained, in between? I think yes. And it's been used in precisely those conversations. I think that's right. How it has been used is the question, of course. If on the one hand you look at this and say, well, this really is about, Ruth was useful and then that was that, then the conclusion might be, really it is the role of church women to manage the kitchen. Yeah. Now, I don't think that's the outcome of the story, but we can't let our discomfort with the conclusion determine how we read the text. I mean, that's always the danger. No, I don't think it's appropriate that churches limit the ministry of women to a very narrow domestic kind of thing. No, that's not scripturally appropriate. Mm-hmm. But I can't let that conclusion determine how I read the Book of Ruth. That's the only point that I would make. We have to let the book stand on itself and see where it takes us. And it certainly is possible that where it takes us is that that God is using assertive, clever women to get things done that men can't get done. That's another way to read the text. And you can take all kinds of evidence from the Book of Ruth to support that. It's not the only way, but it's a pretty powerful reading, I think. So that moves us into this conversation about what have you learned? What have you observed? What do you take from this reading of this little book? I like the little books in the Bible the best. I really do.
Yeah.
Philemon, Jonah, Ruth, because you can really take a scalpel to them and a microscope and really have some fun. So, what do you take from this? Yeah.
Jacob's wives, okay, that's Leah and who were the other
Leah and
ones?
Rachel.
Rachel.
Yeah.
They had 100,000 relatives that were in Egypt for 400 years, right? And they exodus. So did Ruth supposed to have that many kids? That's what they. Oh no, that's what the thing said. You were supposed to have, may your descendants be as many as.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because you're building up the house of Israel.
I was wondering if they had a lot of descendants also.
It's the biggest tribe.
Yeah, but I mean
Numerically.
Ruth and Boaz.
We don't know.
They said, may you have that many.
Yeah. They had the one that counts.
Yeah, the one that counts.
I mean,
right?
in terms of the story and where it ends up in the genealogy, they had the one that counts. They had Obed, who leads to David. Mm-hmm. And there's a textual, kind of a common factor here that can give us sort of a tip off to one of the reasons for the book, and there's a tremendous concern for sustaining the generations, sustaining the line. And the genealogy of David, as it's written in verse 18, as it begins in verse 18, it's the same language that you find throughout the book of Genesis. Now, these are the descendants of, and then you'll get a piece of genealogy. And that happens if I remember right, 7 times in the book of Genesis, these pieces of genealogy. And the generations, it's a specific Hebrew term. It's the same Hebrew term every time. The word for generations is toledoth. And so some scholars think that there was just a book of the generations called the Toledoth book. Well, this is another piece of the Toledoth book. These are the generations. These are the Toledoth. The Toledoth book, the book of the generations, was put together during and after the exile, it appears. And so think about this. You think, the chosen people given the promised land, you are to be the light to the nations. Along comes Babylon and wipes out the temple, takes the top 10 or 15% of the population back into exile. The rest of the folks left behind don't know their right hand from their left. And it appears that the people, the chosen people of God, may well disappear from the pages of history. That's what it feels like in the midst of the exile. And that's with some historical justification. The 10 northern tribes disappear from the pages of history in 722 BCE when the Assyrians invade. So it is certainly possible to simply be wiped from the pages of history. So that's the context in which this book of the generations, one generation to the next, in response to this command to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. That's the framework of that. For people who are afraid that they might disappear from the pages of history, this account of the generations is an account of God's faithfulness. God will keep it going. Is that a way to read the book of Ruth? That's where it ends up. It ends up with this little piece of the Toledoth book. And is the experience of Naomi a reflection of the exile? Naomi, everybody dies, huh? While she's in a foreign land. Back she comes. How is the line going to continue? Is that part of what's going on? There is a consistent kind of wondering and then emphasis, wondering about God's faithfulness. Early on in the book of Ruth, Naomi wonders. Naomi says aloud, basically, I'm bereft. I've been abandoned. God has done this to me. There's a sense in which Naomi is, as I have said several times, sort of, Job in a skirt. I've lost everything. God has done this to me. And then the women in Bethlehem remind her at the end here, here's what God has really done for you. Provided a son. God is faithful. God continues the line. Well, is that what's at stake here? Yeah, Al.
So you said that the exodus to Babylon happened,
The exile
to Babylon happened while Naomi was gone, or it happened before?
No, let me track that again. There is, if you think about the exile experience, there they are in Judah. The Babylonians come, they take away the population. It's Naomi's experience is like an exile experience. Off she goes to a foreign land. Everybody dies. What are we going to do? Back she comes, and God starts the line up again. So what kind of good news would that be to people coming back from exile, for example? You know, friends, let's take you back to this story from 700 years ago or so, and look at what God did through Ruth. For one of our mothers in the faith who had been carried off to a foreign land, lost everything, came back, God starts the line again. Is that sort of the gospel according to the book of Ruth for the people who first read it? Maybe.
And if women were the storytellers, not men, but men were the scribes, was something lost?
Well, who do you think wrote this? I mean, and I'm not saying who did. Could it be that a woman or a group of women wrote the story? Is it more likely that it is some of these post-exile scribes who are trying to write a little gospel? It's a minority view, but some scholars are modestly sure that this was written by a woman or women, and others are absolutely sure it wasn't, of course. And until we find a manuscript signed by some woman who says, oh, by the way, which we're not going to find, we can't know. But does it make a difference in your reading if you imagine that it was written by a woman or a community of women, or by a man or a community of men?
Might be more detailed if a woman wrote it. I'm just thinking.
Yeah, there's a lot of work that has been done on whether the book of Ruth was originally two separate stories that are kind of stitched together. I mean, was there a story that really focused mostly on Naomi, and Ruth disappearing here is part of that story that was mostly Naomi's story, and there was a different story that focused more on Ruth, and they've been brought together. Again, unless we would find the work of the editor, buried somewhere, we can't know that. But there is scholarly speculation that that's how we can account for some of these things, that these are two different stories that don't fit together as well as we might wish they would. Regardless of that, here it is in the Bible as it is. Regardless of how it came to us, there it is as it is. What's it good for? And there is no conclusive answer to that, but more a question for us here. What does the book of Ruth do to you, or for you, or through you? What is it? What has it said to you? How has it impacted you?
How about grief after? Thinking about grief, and she lost her whole family, and then she started up again. Life after grief.
Life after grief. Yeah. And how powerful that can be for us as individuals. How powerful perhaps that might have been for people after the exile, if that's where it was. Look at poor old Naomi. and God sent her the help she needed. Might be one way to read it. Here's this daughter-in-law who really, if she had any sense, should have gone back to her own family. Now, I don't know if that's the case, but you can read it that way. And she became worth more to Naomi than 7 sons.
But the two of them women, if you go by the Greek theory, it's unbelievable that they would rise above to fit into the purpose that they had of maintaining this line of lineage that we all know.
There is this, there's the shared experience of grief, which perhaps could have bound them more closely to one another, and that they strengthened one another. I mean, when when two poles can lean against each other, they are stronger than when they're just side by side. Yeah, that could certainly be taken from the text, from the story.
The complexity and the value of relationships is a lot of that in here. Relationships, human relationships, and or relationships with God. I mean, I think it has there's been a lot of discussion on this short book of the Bible in our group here. It fosters stimulation. Maybe it's maybe some of it is.
Well, that's partly because you have a teacher who complexifies everything unnecessarily, you know, I mean.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Otherwise, I have to start preparing another set of lectures here, I mean.
Well, no, I think it's good for all of us, I think.
The relationships are, they are complex and ambiguous. They are not just all wrapped up with a bow in this little book. I am, it's sometimes a little frustrating. On the other hand, I'm kind of glad the writer doesn't just wrap everything up with a they lived happily ever after. We don't know if Ruth lived happily ever after. We don't know. We don't know.
Or she continued to be a Moabite from Moab.
Moabite from Moab.
You know, I mean, there's another.
I like it.
I mean, that's another dimension of this is, you know, not only what to do with strangers, but what it's like to be a stranger. I remember in a conflicted congregation where I was the consultant, interviewing a woman who had been a member of the congregation for, I think it was 38 years. But she knew that she was still considered a newcomer and a stranger because she hadn't been born there. And that's not true in every congregation, but there's some truth about that in human community, that embracing the other, the stranger, is no small task for any of us. Being that stranger, that outsider, can be just an overwhelming experience.
It never says how the other ladies accepted her. It was some jealousy that she got picked out, you know, and got the favoritism in the fields and everything, that they're working hard too, and they're with their own people, and yet this stranger comes in and there's some jealousy.
You know, when Ruth and Naomi first arrive, the women of Bethlehem, this sort of chorus in the background, they celebrate the fact that Naomi has returned. Yeah, not any mention of Ruth, but they're happy that Naomi is back. When we get to the end here, that same chorus of women celebrates Ruth for producing this son, and she's faithful and more to Naomi than 7 sons, this daughter-in-law. But they're still just talking to Naomi. I mean, we can wonder if Ruth ever really becomes part of that community of women or not. To some degree, back to Connie's observation a while ago, was Ruth just useful as opposed to being valued? You know, and you know, when new people come to a congregation, sometimes what they can experience is that they're useful but not necessarily valued. Yay, we're so glad you're here. Would you like to be a Sunday school teacher?
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah. Well, you know, we know how we might respond to that. Thank you, I think. Yeah. Yeah. So was Ruth ever really embraced? It's not clear. Does the book of Ruth challenge us to think about our own treatment of the stranger, the outsider, comer, of stranger or outsider? Yeah, Al, please.
Does a rich man's wife have any effect on her position in that culture? Yeah,
Yeah, sure.
she was just a stranger.
Yes.
Yeah,
She
sure.
now
Yeah.
becomes a very wealthy man's wife.
Yeah. Yeah.
That raises her status, but doesn't mean she's included, but she'll be respected because she's a rich man's wife.
Yeah. At the very least, that would be sort of the minimum that would happen. That's right. Women in that cultural setting would not have their own source of honor, by and large. That would be tied to a male, which is why women are, you know, either someone's daughter or husband, or at best, you know, mother. So Ruth's status, becoming Boaz's wife and in his household, yeah, her honor status would go up significantly. Yeah. Does that result in an increase in esteem or appreciation? Well, maybe not. Is it as likely that it might result in an increase in envy rather than esteem?
Could be.
In an honor and shame culture, that's actually more likely. It doesn't say for sure, but in that Mediterranean honor and shame culture, for Ruth to gain all this status, really almost through no fault of her own, that's how it might look to outsiders, would be more likely to produce envy than appreciation. So it may well be that actually her interactions in the community get worse, not better. It may be. We don't know, but that's a good observation. Her material circumstances and her social status would have improved significantly. Would that be reflected in the actual relationships that she had? That's not clear. No, that's not clear.
So we're just gonna say Ruth is a trophy wife, and she has a child to maintain her security.
That's absolutely one way to read what happens to her. That is clearly one way to read what happens to Ruth.
Yeah. But look,
May or may not.
is Melania Trump
You said
accepted
that.
by the other president's wives?
Oh, you mentioned that.
Yeah, there's a difference between, grudgingly respect. I mean, for the sake of the office,
Office of the President.
that's a distinction that would be helpful, so that the office of Boaz's wife is respected. Is the person appreciated? That's a different question.
I guess so, yeah.
Yeah. Ruth, you wanted to say?
Oh, I was just going to comment that before we dissected this chapter,
Mm-hmm.
my thought of the book of Ruth was that it showed compassion, and the love for her mother-in-law, and respect, and that was my feeling about the Book of Ruth. I mean, like I said before, we began to dissect all these other little things. I can still understand what we're talking about with Boaz and what, you know, the